Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Khirbet Khizeh by S. Yizhar. This is the pen name for Yizhar Smilansky. And he wrote this it was published in 1949. He probably wrote it in 1948. And it's a beautiful and difficult and brilliant novel from the Jewish side of the expulsions that happened in 1948. What happens if you're a Haganah soldier, an IDF soldier, and as the expulsions are going on, you know in your heart that this is something immoral and something that's wrong? How would you express that as a young man? And this novel, I think, does a wonderful job. And I think what's interesting is I've read from Hassan Kanafani beautiful descriptions of what it looked like from the Palestinian side. Of course, it's reasonable to expect that there are beautiful expressions of what happened from the Zionist side, from the Jewish side. And it's surprising because obviously it's told from their perspective, the people who are doing the expelling, but they still, this author does such a magnificent job of capturing what that was like in a way that humanizes the Palestinians, even as he acknowledges that what they're doing is wrong. So I think it is very much a book in the tradition of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, Mark Twain's The War Prayer, literature that risks being called not patriotic in order to tell the truth about something, that war is not some glamorous thing that is always holy and sanctified, but that sometimes, or rather very often, war is gone to for the wrong reasons or for completely manipulated reasons. And people of conscience, of morals, of judgment, they have to stand up for that. And interestingly, this book managed to work its way into the official curriculum of Israel at some point, listed as option, not required reading, but as optional reading. And I'm sure it must have disturbed a number of young Israelis, probably woken some up. The person who wrote the afterword to this edition talked about the fact that he was woken up by participating in the war in Lebanon in 1982 and quote unquote got radicalized and now helps Palestinians protest, work against violent Israeli settlers. But anyway, I can't recommend this book enough. The soldier manages to describe for us a single expulsion in detail of a village. There are other actions that happen in the book, but it's very short. As you can see, I think the novel itself is only 113 pages. It's very short, very much worth a read, very packs a punch. It is very short, but it'll linger with you as it has with me for days after you finish reading it. So with that being said, let me read some of it to you so you can experience it yourself. So here he's talking about coming into a village that appeared to be abandoned. The huts appeared to have been uninhabited for a very long time. A harvest of fear and a crop of evil rumors had reaped untimely haste, and the writhing of a worm hurrying to meet its fate. We kicked in the wicket in the big wooden gate in the clay walls and entered a square courtyard with a hut on one flank and another hut on the other. Sometimes, when they had the means and the time was right, these people would erect a clay hut over the casing of the well house below, training a vine or two and making an arbor, and bringing some concrete blocks, which didn't need plastering, at least as long as their corners were so attractive. Pepper bushes and autumn eggplants were rotting below in the grass and moldering near the water tap, and roses peeped out of the rampant weeds and climbed above them, and paths extended to some place inside the groves. Another kick and a casual glance into an abandoned home, in a storage room where the dust of crops coated cobwebs both tattered and greasy-looking. Walls that had been attentively decorated with whatever was at hand, a home lined with plaster and a molding painted blue and red, little ornaments that hung on the walls, testifying to a loving care whose foundations had now been eradicated. Traces of female wisdom hath builded her house, paying close attention to myriad details whose time now had passed, an order intelligible to someone and a disorder in which somebody at his convenience had found his way. Remnants of pots and pans that had been collected in a haphazard fashion, as need arose, touched by very private joys and woes that a stranger could not understand. Tatters that made sense to someone who was used to them, a way of life whose meaning was lost, diligence that had reached its negation, and a great, very deep muteness had settled upon the love, the bustle, the bother, the hopes, and the good and less good times. So many unburied corpses. But we were already tired of seeing things like this. We had no more interest in such things. One glance, a step or two were enough for the courtyard, the house, the well, the past, and the present, and their attentive silence. And although there might be an abandoned pitchfork, or a fine-looking hoe, or a good and valuable pipe wrench, momentarily inciting you to pick it up and weigh it in your hand, as one might in a market or a farmyard, and things that ought to be in their place, and even stirring an urge, incidentally, to take the motor from the well, and the pipes, 5-inch, and the beams from above, and the bricks from below, and the wooden boards, we could always find a use for them in our yard, and send them home. There was such a tickling pleasure in getting such easy benefit, in getting rich quick, in picking up ownerless property and making it your own, and conquering it for yourself. And plans were already being made, right away, and it was already decided what was going to be done with almost all of these things at home, and how it would be done, except that we had been in so many villages already, and picked things up and thrown them away, taken them and destroyed them, and we were too used to it. So we picked up the fine-looking ownerless hoe, or pitchfork, and hurled it down to the ground, if possible aiming it at something that would shatter at once, so as to relieve it of the shame of not being of use, with real destruction, once and for all, putting an end to its silence. This is the corresponding narrative to the Nakba. So if what we experience in the Nakba is what happens when people are leaving their homes, here's what is being glimpsed of their homes by the conqueror, by the expeller. And it's an important part of the narrative. You actually need both. And I think it's a real bittersweet aspect of literature that we have to take these two parts together to get a picture of what was going on in the Nakba from both sides. And as I say, it's seductive because it's written so beautifully, but it's still necessary. It's an important part of the narrative. And I think Palestinians can read that and appreciate it, not because they appreciate what had happened, but that this writer had managed to capture that soul of what was going on in that house, those lives that were lived there, the simple beauty with which the house was decorated, and the loss that was involved. So here the narrator, he does this a couple times in the text, but I think this is the first time in which he is having an inner dialogue with himself about what is right and what is wrong about what they are doing. And it seemed that this was the advice that I had preferred from the outset, but I was overburdened with words. And once I had started, I didn't know how to stop. And since I had no one to argue with, I argued with myself. And this is what I said to myself. But this is a war. Well, is it a war or isn't it? And if it's a war, well, all's fair in war. Second voice. War? Against who? These people? First voice, continuing as though he heard nothing. Perfect saints they're not, but who is? And even if our intentions are good and honest, you can't go into the water and not get wet. Wonder of wonders. To understand and agree that we've got to act, that's one thing, but to set out and harden your heart and do all sorts of things, that's always something else. What's more, who is it who has to be tough and harden his heart? Whoever happens to be tough and indifferent anyway. Short break. Immediately, with an apologetic fury that turned into a counterattack, and those villages that we took by storm in the war, were they any different? Or those who ran away of their own accord, frightened by their own shadows? Or villages full of bandits for whom the fate of Sodom is too good? Weren't they entirely different? But not just this. Something was still unclear. Just a kind of bad feeling, like being forced into a nightmare and not being allowed to wake up from it. You're caught up with several voices. You don't know what. Maybe the answer is to stand up and resist? But maybe the opposite. To see and be and feel until the blood flows in order to what? Time is passing. Man, emotional pause. You are so weak. Another pause. If you look, you'll burst. Bleeding heart, bleeding heart, bleeding heart. This, he as the expulsion is happening from the village, the author gives us a tableau of each different type of villager. I don't have time to read each of those tableaus, but this particular tableau was particularly striking because I've read about this type of woman over and over as I've studied the Nakba, and it was wonderful to see her observed by the expeller. Then we saw a woman who was walking in a group of 3 or 4 other women. She was holding the hand of a child about 7 years old. There was something special about her. She seemed stern, self-controlled, austere in her sorrow. Tears, which hardly seemed to be her own, rolled down her cheeks. And the child, too, was sobbing a kind of stiff-lipped, "What have you done to us?" It suddenly seemed as if she were the only one who knew exactly what was happening. So much so that I felt ashamed in her presence and lowered my eyes. It was as though there were an outcry in their gait, a kind of sullen accusation. "Damn you." We also saw that she was too proud to pay us the least attention. We understood that she was a lioness, and we saw that the lines of her face had hardened with furrows of self-restraint and a determination to endure her suffering with courage. And how now, when her world had fallen into ruins, she did not want to break down before us. Exalted in their pain and sorrow, above our wicked existence, they went on their way, and we could also see how something was happening in the heart of the boy, something that, when he grew up, could only become a viper inside him, that same thing that was now the weeping of a helpless child. Something struck me like lightning. All at once, everything seemed to mean something different, more precisely, exile. This was exile. This was what exile was like. This was what exile looked like. And there's more that goes on, and a couple paragraphs later, he ends with, "What in fact had we perpetrated here today?" And there's a reflection that what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto, what were the things that were happening to the Jews, and how they turned around and perpetrated that on the Palestinians. Not only as if they'd learned nothing, but almost as if they'd been tutored in what to do to the Palestinians by what had been done to them. And of all people, the Palestinians were the ones who were least deserving of it because they weren't the ones who perpetrated that original crime on the Jews. Words rang in my ears. I did not know where from. I passed among them all, among those weeping aloud, among those silently grinding their teeth, those feeling sorry for themselves and for what they were leaving behind, those who railed at their destiny and those who quietly submitted to it, those ashamed of themselves and their disgrace, those already making plans to sort themselves out somehow, those weeping for the fields that would be desolate, and those silenced by exhaustion, eaten away by hunger and fear. I wanted to discover if among all these people there was a single Jeremiah mourning and burning, forging a mouth of fury in his heart, crying out in stifled tones to the old God in heaven atop the trucks of exile. And as I say, I'm just reading you a few of these very beautiful passages, but the book is full of them. I don't mean to say, here are the beautiful passages I'm reading. I mean, the book is extremely well written. And I'm told in the original Hebrew, it's just written in a Hebrew of its time period. Remember, the Hebrew is a revived language, and it's been growing and developing all this time. And from what I've read about the Hebrew of this particular book, it's particularly striking. But it comes through in translation. The phrasing, the wording in the sentences, it's so poetic and beautiful and attractive. So he's reflecting on what has happened to the villagers, about their expulsion, and then he's thinking, okay, well, what does that mean for the Jews? He says, of course, absolutely. Why hadn't I realized it from the outset? Our very own Khirbet Khizeh. Questions of housing and problems of absorption, and hooray! We'd house and absorb and how? We'd open a cooperative store, establish a school, maybe even a synagogue. There would be political parties here. They'd debate all sorts of things. They would plow fields and sow and reap and do great things. Long live Khirbet Khizeh! Who then would ever imagine that once there had been some Khirbet Khizeh that we emptied out and took for ourselves? We came, we shot, we burned, we blew up, expelled, drove out, and sent into exile. What in God's name were we doing in this place? So as they say, a beautiful short novel, well worth your time. One of my favorite books that I've read during this entire exploration of the Palestine issue, and can't recommend it enough. There'll be a link to this book in the description below, as well as a link to the Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, and a link to that title, that short story, not even a short story, it's like 3 or 4 pages, The War Prayer by Mark Twain. You can there'll just be a link to read that online. It's free, but as I say, it lives in that genre of protest against popular opinion, particularly regarding war, by somebody who is not content to just sit by and accept what somebody is doing in his name, his or her name. So there will be a link to buy this book. That's one way you can support the channel in the description below. Another would be to join my Patreon or the YouTube members. That's a way for you to support the channel in a more explicit way, as well as a chance for you to get early releases of these videos or to chat with me about what you're doing. You can also select from my Amazon wish list, or as I found out recently when a book came in the other day, that you can just send a book of your own choosing that you'd like me to read. I didn't realize that was a functionality. But as they say, a lot of those books will probably be reviewed in 2025 just because 2024 is dedicated to this. That's another thing in 2024, a portion of the proceeds from all of these different channels will be going towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps children in Palestine get medical care that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. Please consider supporting that cause either indirectly through supporting the channel or directly by going to their website and making a pledge yourself. As always, enjoy your reading.